I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary. And that was the only good thing that happened, was that they were there. And they had that structure, they had people around them.
It was neither a discussion regarding upcoming royal protocol nor another dispute inside the household that prompted Anne to seek an urgent meeting with her brother. Instead, she stepped into the room, holding a leather-bound folder in deep blue, a collection of documents kept out of sight for 3 whole years. With Camilla remaining just a few doors down, Charles was forced to look at the evidence his sister laid before him. Without his knowledge, his wife had been quietly expanding her authority over internal palace staffing, family communication channels, and official sovereign updates. Before we examine the massive fallout this discovery triggered for the royal family, hit the subscribe button to stay updated on every development. Clarence's house grew completely silent as night fell. Arriving entirely unattended, Anne requested that Charles lock the entrance. Though this London residence was supposed to provide a sanctuary from court politics, it served tonight as the exact stage where those politics were stripped bare. This leather folder, she revealed, was a meticulously gathered dossier, documenting a systematic grab for power rather than mere suspicion. Charles refused to pick it up. He was well aware of Anne's long-standing skepticism regarding Camilla's covert maneuvers for authority. While the queen consort viewed his sister's blunt loyalty as a direct challenge to her status, the monarch pushed the documentation back across the desk surface. He firmly cautioned Anne that leveling accusations of dishonesty against his wife could tear the family apart, transforming private friction into an outright battle. The king urged her to drop the matter before the damage became completely uncontrollable. Anne held her ground. She explained that her delay was deliberate, knowing that raw resentment does not equal proof and that a verified trail of written messages carries far more weight than courtroom gossip. Though her delivery remained controlled, Charles could sense a deep sorrow beneath her words. She was forcing the monarch to confront his own blindness toward the shifting dynamics within his residence. Everything shifted the moment Charles finally undid the clasp of the folder. The recovered messages exposed how Camilla had been collaborating with household advisors to quietly widen her jurisdiction over high-level staffing, internal family intelligence, and direct pathways to the sovereign. Royal briefings dictate what the ruler learns, who gains an audience, and which decisions receive immediate focus. Alongside multiple drafts, Charles instantly recognized the distinctive script of his wife. A particular sheet bore a timestamp originating 3 years prior. This was no sudden response to recent difficulties. The plan had been quietly maturing while he placed absolute faith in those nearest to him. The monarch reached the memorandum and froze. The document outlined an organized framework enabling Camilla to dictate who could gain an audience with him during bouts of sickness, exhaustion, overseas travel, or periods of private retreat. Next to the name of a prominent family member, he spotted a couple of words: anticipated resistance. Anne watched his face turn to stone. Camilla had not merely stumbled into this power, she had specifically targeted the one individual who possessed the strength to disrupt her plans. Yet, before Charles could challenge the woman sharing his home, he had to unearth exactly how Anne became the solitary figure Camilla desperately sought to avoid. To the public, Anne and Camilla stood side by side on grand balconies, partook in identical state functions, and dedicated their lives to the preservation of the monarchy. Behind closed doors, however, they embodied 2 fundamentally opposing definitions of devotion. Anne believed that influence must be earned through personal hardship, while Camilla maintained that self-preservation demanded constant access, strategic preparation, and structural oversight. Positioned between them was Charles, a sibling to one, a partner to the other, and now the deeply wounded target of a quiet betrayal from which neither woman could retreat. Long after his sister departed into the night, Charles sat undisturbed with the dossier. He had walked alongside Anne through every chapter of existence. From early childhood rivalry to the immense pressure of state obligations, she had witnessed him in moments of absolute certainty, deep self-doubt, and profound weariness caused by a crown he could never cast aside. Holding the lifetime honor of Princess Royal, Anne had never altered uncomfortable realities just to spare his feelings. This was precisely why her accusation cut so deep. If she had chosen to break her silence, it meant keeping quiet had become far more perilous than a palace crisis. Camilla carried an entirely different burden from her past. Decades of rejection, public mockery, and intense scrutiny had passed before she finally secured her position beside the man she loved. Achieving her current title as queen consort had brought status, but it had failed to bring permanent security. She harbored a deep anxiety that should Charles's strength falter, the hard-won public acceptance she enjoyed would evaporate without his royal shield. While such anxiety failed to justify her secret maneuvers, it shed light on why structural control had started to feel like her only means of survival. Charles reflected on those quiet evenings when Camilla had supported him through periods of profound isolation and second-guessing. She was the one who listened when the world made demands, offered solace when duty forbade any display of vulnerability, and convinced him that he possessed the strength to carry the throne. Now, that very same companion had apparently established a system designed to regulate his visitors and filter the realities he was permitted to hear. Affection and deception had become so thoroughly intertwined that he found it impossible to untangle them. No sense of triumph crossed Anne's mind. Standing isolated in the corridor, she anchored herself against a seat and drifted into thought. Exposing the scheme might safeguard her brother's sovereign rule, but it risked shattering the ultimate emotional sanctuary Charles had left. Her own name surfaced systematically across the intercepted documents. Camilla had explicitly identified Anne as the most formidable roadblock to reshaping palace dynamics, suggesting that highly sensitive intelligence should only reach Charles after being vetted by her personal staff. The monarch summoned his private secretary and slid a single annotated page across the desk. He demanded to know if directives had been dispatched across the palace using his authority without his explicit sign-off. The official averted his eyes, pausing before answering. That brief hesitation spoke louder than any verbal admission. Though the betrayal manifested on official stationery, its true genesis occurred 3 years earlier during a secluded family gathering that converted Camilla's deep-seated anxiety into an active, underground operation. 3 years prior to the opening of the Blue Folder, no grand arguments had taken place, nor had any public rift formed. The true beginning was far quieter and infinitely more perilous. Following a secluded royal dinner at Windsor, Camilla happened to catch a private conversation regarding the operational protocol should Charles suddenly find himself incapacitated or unable to handle his grueling routine. No one leveled charges against her, nor did anyone menace her standing. Yet, a solitary phrase left her utterly convinced that without a definitive counter-strategy, the life she had spent decades constructing could vanish in an instant. The evening had actually commenced in a relaxed fashion. Charles, Camilla, Anne, William, and a handful of senior administrative figures met at Windsor to address the multiplying institutional burdens weighing on the sovereign. William spoke with measured caution regarding continuity, while Anne pointed out that crown responsibilities could not rest solely on a single exhausted individual. Such long-term organizational planning was intended to keep the monarchy functional if its chief fell ill or became temporarily unavailable. For the rest of the room, it was standard institutional prudence. But for Camilla, shaped by decades of societal hostility, it sounded as though plans were being laid for an era where Charles would no longer be there to shield her. Camilla exited the dining hall without dropping her mask of composure. Yet as she moved past the library, distinct voices drifted through a partially unlatched doorway. A high-ranking court operative remarked to Anne that during any extended period where Charles was absent, the Blood family must remain the undisputed epicenter of authority. Anne offered no objection to the claim, merely inquiring how structural consistency would be preserved. To the listening spouse, however, the exchange sounded brutal. Camilla became convinced that Anne and the official had already agreed to relegate her to the sidelines the precise moment her husband's health declined. Hours later, Charles discovered her still awake, sitting next to a cup of tea that had gone cold. Camilla asked him directly if her presence would retain any significance if he were no longer capable of maintaining her status. Smiling at the question, he dismissed the anxiety as an impossibility and offered a comforting gesture. The king assumed that marital affection had resolved her doubts. It had not. While she felt his love, Camilla also felt entirely misunderstood. His comforting words restored calm to the room while leaving the underlying panic completely untouched within her spirit. By the following morning, that lingering panic transformed into a hard determination. Camilla arranged an unrecorded meeting with that very same palace strategist. She requested a formal, confidential blueprint outlining which sovereign administrative capabilities could be funneled through her personal staff without necessitating a public proclamation or a legal transfer of authority from Charles. The court functionary drafted a highly confidential memorandum, an internal strategic brief detailing potential avenues of governance. That specific brief became the foundational page of the dossier now resting in the hands of Anne. The focus of the operation quickly shifted. Preparing for continuity evolved into seeking daily leverage, which eventually transformed into an outright grasp for administrative control over palace appointments, scheduling diaries, personal mail, and private audiences with Charles. Years down the line, Anne discovered that the strategist who formulated that initial text was still actively serving within the palace walls. More troubling still, he was locked into a scheduled briefing with Camilla the very morning after the secret was uncovered. With the true roots of the deception finally laid bare, Anne recognized that the era of quiet fact-finding had come to an end. Camilla had to be faced directly before the administrative framework she constructed could be mobilized to shield her. Camilla walked into the room anticipating another standard, carefully mediated family briefing. Instead, she was met with the sight of Anne positioned by the hearth, Charles seated silently behind his desk, and the blue leather folder lying completely open between them. No public relations advisors, personal assistants, or diplomatic phrases were present to soften the blow or maintain appearances. The moment the entrance clicked shut, Anne locked eyes with Camilla and delivered the exact inquiry the wife had spent 3 years ensuring Charles would never hear. Precisely how much of his crown did you intend to siphon off? Charles had intentionally emptied his private workspace prior to the encounter. He removed every court clerk and official who might subsequently absorb the blame, determined that this specific crisis would not be obscured by bureaucratic confusion or claims of misinterpreted directives. The file itself was a highly organized compilation of proof, uniting secret letters, handwritten revisions, and policy proposals into a single damning record. The king requested that Anne spearhead the questioning, as his own sense of betrayal had become far too agonizing and personal. This tactical decision placed his sister in direct conflict with his wife, leaving absolutely nowhere for either party to retreat. Camilla stared back at Anne as her initial shock quickly transformed into pure anger. She branded the allegations a complete misrepresentation, maintaining that the paperwork focused strictly on emergency measures rather than personal ambition. Camilla contended that every single draft had been formulated exclusively to safeguard Charles if sickness, fatigue, or immense state pressures disrupted his normal routine. She pivoted toward her husband, fully counting on him to strike down the criticism. Charles offered nothing but silence. That refusal to speak hurt her far more deeply than any accusation leveled by his sister. Stepping forward, Anne countered that protective measures enacted through absolute secrecy could never be classified as devotion, regardless of how elegantly they were framed in official language. Anne then dropped a devastating detail. She had personally cross-referenced the handwritten alterations against Camilla's script samples. Camilla's demeanor shifted instantly. She realized at that moment that Anne had not based this confrontation on palace rumors. She had arrived with undeniable proof. Charles carefully lifted a single sheet from the leather binder. His vocal tone tightened noticeably as he demanded to know why his spouse had recommended filtering private access to his office during any period he found himself physically or mentally depleted. Camilla reached across to take the document, but the king abruptly pulled it back. Though the gesture was minor, it shattered something fundamental between the couple. Camilla finally confessed to penning the revisions, but maintained they were never intended to become active without his eventual signature. Anne shot back by listing 3 distinct operations currently running within the household that proved otherwise. Specific state briefings had already been rerouted through alternative channels. Highly delicate royal requests had regularly cleared Camilla's personal staff first. Furthermore, several months back, Anne herself had been locked out of a sensitive family council by utilization of one of these newly recommended protocols. Camilla vehemently denied orchestrating that specific lockout, claiming an overzealous staff member must have overstepped the boundaries she originally envisioned. Rising to his feet, Charles instructed both individuals to exit his office. As Camilla walked toward the door, his final directive brought her to a standstill. She was strictly forbidden from communicating with any court official until he unearthed every individual who had been operating under her unsanctioned mandate. The fierce showdown shattered the quiet of the estate. Yet the far more dangerous threat now lay with the unexposed palace operatives who had successfully turned Camilla's private anxieties into operational royal policy. While Camilla had written the inquiries, modified the texts, and guarded the operation, she had not modified royal itineraries, rerouted intelligence folders, or restricted palace access on her own. Someone had taken her inner panic and engineered it into daily palace routine. As Charles scrutinized the signatures anchoring the bottom of each memorandum, the web of betrayal expanded far past his marriage. The authority of the throne had not been compromised via a singular, dramatic coup. It had been gradually shifted, choice, by insiders who calculated that the king was far too trusting to notice the adjustments. Spreading the gathered files across his desk, Charles began meticulously charting how every underground recommendation had quietly woven itself into the daily mechanics of the court. Sovereign power does not always shift through sweeping royal decrees. It frequently flows through everyday intelligence folders, visitor logs, daily agendas, and administrative advice that effectively dictates what the ruler sees before a choice can even be made. A number of palace operatives had rationalized that granting greater oversight to Camilla would offer a layer of institutional stability whenever the ruler became overwhelmed or overly fatigued. Yet, the crucial reality remained that Charles had never given this dynamic his official blessing. Charles dismissed his entire staff, leaving only his private secretary in the room. Pointing directly to an altered itinerary, he demanded to know how many state choices had been presented to him only after alternative options had been systematically erased behind the scenes. The official was completely unable to supply a number. The monarch did not raise his voice. A profound sense of humiliation supplanted his initial anger as Charles recognized that his royal assent had essentially been manufactured by controlling the parameters of what he was allowed to evaluate. His innate trust had transformed him into an open target, and the individuals serving under his banner had mistaken that trust for an open checkbook. William entered the room to discover his father gazing at a state calendar riddled with handwritten modifications. The prince immediately comprehended the gravity of the situation. A ruling monarch cannot govern with true independence if his inner circle alters every scenario before it lands on his desk. Charles confessed that he could no longer differentiate between audiences that truly reflected his personal intent and those engineered for him by others. William took a position by his side, though even his steady, composed presence could do little to dull the sting of the admission. The emergency audit quickly exposed heavily modified intelligence pathways. Distinct family matters had been systematically directed to clear Camilla's personal office prior to reaching Charles. One high-ranking strategist accepted full ownership of implementing the system, but maintained that Camilla had never directly commanded those specific blockades. During a formally recorded internal deposition, he explained that her handwritten annotations had been interpreted by staff as overarching strategic blueprints. This explanation only heightened the underlying danger. Camilla had constructed a machinery that other actors expanded until even she lost the ability to govern its reach. Anne stepped back into the room before the deposition wrapped up. She lifted the strategist's official palace identification card from the desk and laid it directly next to the blue folder. This card provided clearance to restricted areas of the estate, meaning its confiscation marked the absolute termination of his operational standing. Charles commanded that the operative be suspended from all duties effective immediately, while a comprehensive investigation unfolded. By the arrival of nightfall, the administrative directive had reverberated throughout the entire royal estate. Camilla recognized the stark reality of what lay ahead. Her personal personnel, media teams, and independent communication lines were about to be systematically taken apart. The underground operation had finally run out of institutional protectors. As the heavy doors of the palace began to isolate her, the immense emotional fallout of her deception became impossible to contain. The opening consequence manifested without any formal warning. Camilla's chief administrative assistant stepped into her private sitting room holding a heavily altered itinerary and laid it down without a word. Scheduled engagements were erased, high-level intelligence privileges were rescinded, and requests that previously moved directly through her office now demanded the written authorization of Charles. For 3 continuous years, Camilla had strategized for the eventual day her leverage might be stripped away. Yet, when the moment finally arrived, the loss was not delivered via public banishment, but through her partner's silent pen stroke. Camilla scrutinized the modified itinerary once, then a second time, as if staring at the text could alter the reality of its content. The temporary mandate returned absolute control over palace staffing, visitor access, and confidential briefings to the king's private office, the compact circle tasked with regulating what information reaches the ruler and when it gets there. While Charles refrained from stripping away her title, he completely dismantled the bureaucratic machinery she had spent years assembling. Anne was designated strictly to oversee the ongoing internal audit. She would not take over Camilla's lost leverage, proving to all observers that her sole intention was the restoration of institutional boundaries rather than a personal grab for authority. Removing her spectacles, Camilla inquired if Charles had transmitted any private message alongside the directive. Her assistant lowered his gaze and confirmed that no words had been sent. Camilla folded the revised schedule with careful deliberation, though the tremor in her hands gave away her composure. The wife had genuinely believed she was shielding her husband from administrative chaos, immense pressure, and adversarial forces within the court. Now, Camilla was forced to look at a much harsher truth. By conducting these operations entirely behind his back, she had stripped him of his fundamental right to define what protection actually meant. Charles isolated himself in an entirely separate wing of the residence, turning away both confrontational encounters and emotional comfort. He examined each gathered file in total solitude until his gaze eventually locked onto the wedding photograph resting next to his workspace. The monarch picked it up, held it tightly for a handful of seconds, and then quietly placed it inside a desk drawer. He chose not to destroy the image. Charles simply lacked the emotional capacity to look at their past joy while staring at absolute proof of her underground operations. His profound sorrow extended far beyond altered palace calendars. The one individual who understood his deepest personal anxieties had weaponized that exact vulnerability to rationalize an administrative system he had never sanctioned. Anne pressed forward with her examination of the confiscated documents until she unearthed a sealed envelope buried deep within Camilla's private files. Camilla had written the message herself but had never dispatched it. Within this documented confession, she openly admitted her paralyzing fear that William and Anne would eventually isolate her, turning her into a mere ceremonial widow stripped of any meaningful voice. Those raw words instantly shifted the emotional framework of the entire crisis. It was deep-seated terror, rather than simple vanity or ambition, that had fueled the entire operation. While Anne refused to pardon the deception, she recognized that profound fear can shed light on a betrayal without fixing the damage it inflicts. Rather than forwarding the letter to the review board the body gathered to evaluate the behavior of court staff, she delivered it straight to her brother. Anne requested that Charles face Camilla first as the man who loved her, and only afterward as the ruler responsible for the integrity of the crown. For the very first time since the blue folder emerged, the institutional machinery of punishment paused, and behind a securely locked door, Charles prepared to discover if any genuine honesty remained between them. No court strategists waited outside the entrance, no official dossiers were arranged on the table, and no formal diplomatic phrasing remained to mask the reality of the situation. Charles requested that Camilla join him in the modest morning room, a space where they had frequently conversed with absolute transparency, before the weight of the crown transformed every private vulnerability into a public hazard. Camilla walked in fully prepared to voice a structured defense of her actions. Yet the moment her eyes caught the unsent letter resting next to his hand, she grasped that the encounter was no longer focused on administrative authority. It was centered entirely on whether their marriage could weather the weight of the truth. Charles had intentionally selected this specific room because it was bound to an earlier chapter of their shared life, a period preceding the era where every discussion carried the immense gravity of the throne. The concept of the crown encompassed not just the ruler's personal title, but the extensive obligations, structural limits, and public faith tied directly to the institution. Within these four walls, however, he desired neither palace functionaries nor official protocol. Anne intentionally stayed away. Having handed over both the gathered evidence and the unmailed confession, she informed her brother that the ultimate resolution had to take place between the husband who had been deceived and the wife who had misled him, not the sibling who brought it to light. Charles demanded to know why Camilla had chosen to entrust palace strategists with deep anxieties she had actively concealed from him. His vocal delivery reflected profound sorrow rather than fiery anger. Camilla responded that she had attempted to voice her concerns regarding the future on numerous occasions, but each time she tried, Charles had merely smiled, offered comforting words, and handled her panic as a minor issue that affection alone could remedy. The king realized at that moment that he had heard her words without ever truly comprehending the panic behind them. Yet, he noted, being misunderstood failed to grant her the right to construct an underground network of authority in secret. Camilla confessed her terror in plain terms. If Charles became ill, if William shifted closer to the throne, or if the family closed ranks around blood and succession lines, she believed she would be left entirely vulnerable and pushed aside. The principle of succession was the immovable framework dictating who receives the crown after the passing of the monarch. Having spent decades battling simply to be accepted, the mere thought of losing everything overnight had entirely consumed Camilla's mind. Charles replied that while her internal terror shed light on how the operation began, it possessed no power to erase the systematic betrayal that followed. Camilla slipped her wedding band from her finger and set it down on the wood between them, stating she would abide by whatever verdict he handed down. Charles stared down at the gold ring, remembering the immense personal price they had both paid to reach this chapter of their lives. Then, with a slow movement, he pushed the band back across the table toward her. The marital union would endure. The underground network of authority would not. Charles proclaimed that while Camilla would retain her official title and her public position by his side, every single independent channel regulating palace appointments, private audience lists, and confidential family briefings was permanently terminated. Camilla accepted the terms without a single argument. Camilla pledged to release every remaining strategist tied to the covert framework, finally admitting that her desperate effort to insulate her standing had very nearly shattered the core trust that gave it value. Charles then requested the presence of Anne and William to stand as witnesses to the formal re-establishment of household boundaries. The marriage had survived, but the protective illusion that previously surrounded it was gone forever, and by the following morning, a singular image outside the palace gates would reveal to the world that the inner mechanics of the monarchy had already shifted. By the arrival of dawn, the secret had breached the palace walls. The general public did not yet have access to every official memorandum, every handwritten editorial note, or every agonizing word exchanged behind closed doors. The public required only a singular reality. Anne had unmasked a 3-year campaign, orchestrated by Camilla's office, to regulate direct access to the king without his explicit knowledge. What had initiated as a deeply personal family crisis transformed instantly into a nationwide evaluation of public trust, marital fidelity, institutional authority, and the absolute limits of influence beside the throne. Charles authorized a tightly regulated official statement just before the morning news broadcasts went live. The text verified that palace administrative operations were undergoing a comprehensive overhaul and declared unequivocally that absolute authority over high-level staffing and royal access resided solely with the monarch. The concept of royal access defined the exact framework regulating who could interact with, brief, or send private messages to the ruler. While the precise phrasing shielded the integrity of the crown, it failed to mask the sheer magnitude of the internal fracture. An event of immense gravity had occurred, and the British public grasped the reality of it instantly. William backed the decision via a formal statement dispatched directly from his own administrative office. The prince spoke in defense of unyielding constitutional boundaries, the legal parameters segregating lawful sovereign governance from backroom personal influence, but explicitly declined to criticize Camilla in a personal capacity. William refused to convert his father's profound personal pain into a strategic opportunity to advance his own standing. This calculated restraint significantly elevated his image as the future monarch, while completely starving the public of the explosive intra-family warfare many media outlets expected. Anne watched the first reports alone. While the front-page commentary celebrated her personal resolve, she experienced absolutely no sense of victory. Her objective had been the correction of a highly perilous bureaucratic system, not Charles's personal marriage, reduced to a source of public media entertainment. Anne listened as television anchors branded her the solitary individual who had rescued the sovereign from the machinations of his own court. Yet each dramatic statement merely served to remind her that her brother's deep personal humiliation had now been transformed into public property. Camilla was forced to weather a far more savage trial by media. Press commentators painted her as highly calculating, overly manipulative, and obsessed with control. Camilla remained motionless until an archival image of her standing next to Charles flashed on screen beneath a banner reading 3 years of secrets. Camilla switched off the monitor. She had successfully saved her marriage, but the hard-won public faith she had spent decades meticulously constructing had crumbled to dust in a single morning. A steady rain fell outside Buckingham Palace as substantial crowds began to assemble near the iron gates. Media merchants displayed front-page prints highlighting Anne exiting Clarence House beneath a bold header. The princess, who told the king, a woman in the crowd looked at the print and remarked softly that at least someone was looking out for him. Concurrently, a prominent national anchor delivered a more profound warning to the public. Backroom personal influence will invariably transform into actual institutional governance the exact moment transparency is replaced by absolute secrecy. Charles attended his prearranged public function that afternoon with Anne walking directly beside him while Camilla was nowhere to be seen. Just before entering the venue, the king paused briefly and gently placed a hand on his sister's arm. That simple public gesture signaled to the entire nation that he fully validated the actions Anne had taken. The country had discovered its champion in Anne. Yet, the ultimate historical verdict on the monarchy would be written not by media headers, but by the absolute boundaries Charles chose to enforce against the individuals sharing his inner circle. Part 6. The Ultimate Verdict and a Kingdom's Enduring Lesson. The concluding assembly was not organized to debate whether Camilla had actively hidden the operation. The physical files, the recovered handwritten edits, and the altered palace routines had already established that reality beyond any shadow of doubt. The lone question left to resolve was what shape the institution of the monarchy would take moving forward. Charles could opt to shield outward appearances, completely banish his spouse, or openly acknowledge that affection, panic, devotion, and institutional control had become dangerously entangled with one another. His ultimate verdict would decide far more than Camilla's personal future. It would clearly define the exact type of sovereign he intended to be for the remainder of his rule. Charles gathered Anne, Camilla, William, and a newly selected team of senior palace administrators behind locked doors. No one entered the room looking to argue. Everyone present understood that the 3-year chapter had officially reached its absolute conclusion. The underground advisory framework, the unofficial web of insiders that had systematically altered the flow of intelligence and visitor access around the ruler, was formally dissolved by royal decree. Every single private restriction was instantly wiped out. All documentation linked to the operation was ordered to be moved directly into the royal archives, and the court functionaries who had operated past their legal mandates were permanently banned from holding positions of trust. Charles turned his attention toward Camilla before speaking to anyone else in the room. He informed her directly that while she would remain his spouse and the nation's queen, she would never again be permitted to run an independent avenue of authority around his office. The king made this specific boundary completely absolute. Trust, Charles emphasized, would have to be painstakingly reconstructed through total transparency rather than insulated through backroom leverage, official standing, or secret compacts. Camilla received the directive in total silence, fully aware that saving her marriage did not wipe away the extensive damage her choices had inflicted on the household. Camilla formally accepted total ownership of her actions before the gathered family. She refrained from shifting the blame to Anne, the dismissed advisors, or the intense hostility she frequently faced outside the palace walls. Camilla admitted directly that her paralyzing fear of losing her standing had pushed her to jeopardize the one relationship she desperately wished to safeguard. Her formal admission was officially entered into the household review, leaving no room for future debate regarding what she had conceded. Anne closed the blue dossier and secured its metal fastener. She handed the gathered evidence directly to the royal archivist, the official tasked with protecting the historic documents of the monarchy for future generations. Charles watched the folder leave the room before turning to lock eyes with his sister, telling her softly, "You did what I could not see needed doing." Anne received no grand new titles, expanded administrative authority, or public declarations of honor. Her true reward was the fully restored independence of her brother. Camilla lost the backroom structural leverage she had spent years trying to secure, but walked away with the marriage she had been terrified of losing. Charles successfully preserved both the authority of his crown and his own innate compassion, though neither asset escaped the crisis completely unblemished. The monarchy ultimately endured because absolute transparency arrived before the silence could inflict permanent institutional destruction. Affection can offer an explanation for panic, but it can never be weaponized to justify structural control. Thus, the blue file was officially sealed, the underground authority completely broken apart, and the royal family left with a single, unalterable truth. The crown can readily forgive the presence of fear, but it cannot survive the weight of deception unless honesty is finally granted entry into the room. Thank you for tuning in. Please remember to show your support by liking and subscribing, and we will catch you in our next video.